Edward Snowden's release of NSA intelligence files has opened a Pandora's box for the security agency and the Obama administration. While one U.S. federal judge ruled in late December that the NSA's telephone data collection program was legal, two other federal courts have accused the NSA of violating the Constitution, and a panel appointed by the president has called for a major overhaul of the agency's operations. At the center of the maelstrom is Edward Snowden. Joining us now to detail the damages and possible outcomes from his actions, in Providence, Rhode Island, Tom Nichols. He's professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. And in New York, New York, Ben Wizner. He is an attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and legal advisor to Edward Snowden. And gentlemen, as I welcome you to our broadcast this evening, perhaps we can start by just having each of you, in a few short phrases, characterize Edward Snowden. Tom Nichols, why don't you go first?
The word I wouldn't use for Edward Snowden is a whistleblower. He's an unfortunate young man. He obviously committed several crimes in stealing government property and scattering them all over the world. Whether or not he's a traitor is up for a U.S. court to decide, but I think he's definitely guilty of multiple crimes. And this notion of being a whistleblower, I think, is probably one of the most misleading words that's contaminated this whole debate from the beginning.
Ben Wizner?
I would say that Edward Snowden is the individual who launched the most significant debate, both in the United States and around the world, about surveillance and privacy that we've seen in at least a generation and probably in nearly 50 years. Someone who observed in secret the construction of a surveillance state that allowed its technological capabilities to outpace democratic controls, and launched a debate that is going to result in changes in all three branches of government, changes in technology and changes in law, both in the United States and abroad.
Tom Nichols, if that in fact is accurate, that sure sounds like a whistleblower. So tell me why you don't think he is.
Well, there are a lot of people who have set off major debates by doing terrible and illegal things. That doesn't make them whistleblowers, and it certainly doesn't speak to any kind of nobility of their motives. I disagree with Mr. Wizner. I think that in the end, the reforms that I think Mr. Wizner and other people hope for probably won't be as dramatic as they think, probably because many of these programs were, in fact, disclosed long before Edward Snowden ever got around to them. What Edward Snowden did was disclose them in an irresponsible, dramatic, and almost hysterical way. And instead of setting off a debate, he set off a panic, primarily among people who don't understand most of these issues.
Ben Wizner, in December, Snowden apparently told the Washington Post, quote, "For me, in terms of personal satisfaction, the mission's already accomplished." If this in fact speaks to motive, maybe you could help us understand what was his mission.
Well, you could help us, too, if you read the rest of that quote. What he said his mission was to change society single-handedly. What he said his mission was to give the public the information that they needed in order to participate in a democratic way in deciding what the balance should be between surveillance and privacy. And before we let that comment about his recklessness go unanswered, let me say this. Edward Snowden has not released a single NSA document to the public. What he did do is turn over many NSA documents to journalists. And every single disclosure that has been made by those journalists and their editors based on their analysis of the public interest and in consultation with the United States government. Now, it's certainly fair to disagree with the public interest judgments that those journalists have made, but let's be very clear, none of this information was turned over in an unmediated way. His tactic was to bring journalists from the Washington Post, now the New York Times, others around the world, into the discussion with the security state about what should be secret and what should be public. I think the fact that we've seen the kind of debate that we've seen since then shows that much of this information should not have been secret in the first place.
Tom Nichols, if that's the case, are the media complicit in Edward Snowden's doings?
Well, first, it's not the case, and I simply can't let that description of what happened pass. Edward Snowden, like Bradley Manning before him, stole thousands upon thousands of documents that he himself could not possibly have read. To this day, Edward Snowden has no idea what's in many of the documents that he released. He didn't release them in some responsible way to careful journalists who vetted these materials. He gave them to Glenn Greenwald, who might be one of the few people involved in this who's at least as irresponsible as Edward Snowden. And then those documents and the knowledge about them made their way through places like Hong Kong, which is under the control of the People's Republic of China, into Russia, although Snowden says he didn't take any with them. Those documents have made their way into Germany. They've been transited through the United Kingdom. They've ended up in Brazil. If this isn't the very definition of reckless, then Mr. Wizner and I used completely different dictionaries.
Well, Mr. Wizner, do you want to tell us why you feel Mr. Snowden had to leave the United States to, quote unquote, complete his mission?
Well, I will. And, it has to do with the law under which he's been charged, which is a World War I era law called the Espionage Act. It, in fact, wasn't even used until the mid-1980s to prosecute anybody for leaks to the press, but only to prosecute people who spied for foreign powers. But in recent years, the government has argued, and courts have agreed, that the espionage law does not distinguish between leaks to the press and the public interest, the kind that go on in Washington actually every day, with or without Edward Snowden, and spying for a foreign government. And in fact, the Department of Justice has argued that providing information to the press is more damaging and more harmful than selling secrets to an enemy, because everybody gets to see it and not just the enemy. And in recent prosecutions under the Espionage Act, the government has succeeded in excluding from the court's or the jury's consideration any positive outcomes that have occurred from the leaks, and hasn't even required the government to show that any harm came. So what we're talking about in legal terms is a strict liability legal regime. Even if everyone agreed that all of the information that Edward Snowden released was valuable and not harmful, he could still face life in prison under these laws, because the law doesn't take into account those public interest benefits. I just do want to say, though, that not a single article has yet been published without consultation with the intelligence community and the United States government. That doesn't mean that they always see eye to eye. Every day newspapers have these conversations with our government and others about what the public should or shouldn't see. But the last thing we want is a regime in which the intelligence community decides by itself what the public will see and what it won't see, because it's always going to overclassify. We never would have learned about torture at Abu Ghraib. We never would have learned about the CIA secret prisons. We never would have learned that the Bush administration engaged in warrantless wiretapping even before there was congressional authorization. It's important for the press to be involved in trying to liberate some of that information from the government. Mr. Snowden was an agent in that process.
Okay, let me get Professor Nichols to respond to that. Does any of that mitigate the concerns that you've already expressed?
No, and Mr. Wizner's piled several issues upon several issues. He's a lawyer, and I'm not going to debate the Espionage Act with a lawyer. However, I am going to debate his characterization of the press and where these leaks went. WikiLeaks has been deeply involved in this process, and as far as I'm concerned, WikiLeaks is a hostile foreign intelligence organization. And I don't have any doubt about that. I think that these revelations have been clearly targeted at disrupting American foreign relations, particularly with our NATO allies. What began as a project to alert Americans to dangers to their civil liberties has turned into an ongoing, and I would argue the most sustained attack on NATO since the end of the Cold War. So this notion that this was just an innocent kid who found some terrible things, handed them over to responsible journalists who've been carefully vetting those materials. And by the way, Mr. Wizner talks about consultation with the U.S. government, which I should say, by the way, I don't represent. I'm here in my capacity as a scholar. But I'm curious, did The Guardian and Alan Rushbridger and Glenn Greenwald all somehow cooperate with the U.S. government in the release of these materials? Because
yes.
Greenwald has been
they didn't
teasing the release of
but
these
actually
materials.
Not only
Sorry, Mr. Nichols, just finish your point, and then we'll get Ben Wizner to come back.
I'm just curious. I'm just curious about the degree to which The Guardian and Glenn Greenwald have been cooperating with the United States government about releasing classified materials, because Glenn Greenwald has made some pretty radical and intemperate statements about what he's going to do with these materials, what's in them. Again, teasing their release a bit at a time, releasing these revelations very strategically. Things have appeared in The Guardian that have turned out to be, at best, questionable.
Okay, you've asked a bunch of questions there,
again,
Professor Nichols.
I think
Let's
this
get an
is
answer
deeply
from Ben
irresponsible.
Wizner. Go ahead, Ben Wizner. Respond to those questions if you would.
Okay, so let me answer the question. Yeah, no, sure. The answer is yes. The Guardian has not published a single story that has included NSA classified documents without consulting with the United States government. The same is true for Glenn Greenwald, and the same is true for every foreign journalistic partner. In fact, they've put it into their contracts with all of those other publications around the world that they are not to publish any secret document without giving the United States an opportunity to weigh in. And I know that in many instances, with The Guardian, with The Washington Post, with The New York Times, the intelligence community or the White House has been able to persuade the journalists to leave out certain key details that they persuaded the journalists would cause harm and would not detract from the story as a whole. So again, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with the judgments that The Guardian and Alan Westberger or The New York Times or The Washington Post, and I should say, that in most of the attacks on the revelations, the most controversial stories have been published by The New York Times and The Washington Post, not by The Guardian or by Glenn Greenwald, the ones that have drawn the most criticism from the intelligence community. I think it's very fair to disagree with the judgments that those newspapers are making, just as I disagreed with the New York Times judgment in withholding for 14 months a story about the NSA in 2004 and 2005. But to say that Mr. Snowden scattered the materials to the wind just defies all evidence.
Okay, Mr. Wizner, let me come in with a follow-up here. Obviously, maybe some of what I'm about to ask might be covered by client-lawyer confidentiality, so I get that. But can you tell us when the last time you had any communication with Edward Snowden was?
I am in communication with him very, very frequently, almost daily.
By telephone, by email, how?
We communicate over encrypted channels, and this is not about attorney-client privilege. This is about security and confidential communications. The United States is not the only government that is trying to intercept Edward Snowden's communications. Okay,
understood. Can you tell us whether he wants to return to the United States to deal with this in whatever fashion, whether it's facing charges or have his day in court or plant his flag somewhere to appeal to the American public, whatever?
Well, he wants to return to the United States, but he does not want to return to the United States to spend a lifetime in prison as punishment for what he perceives as his act of conscience. And under the law as it stands, unless the government decides to extend some leniency or clemency, he would be looking at almost certain life imprisonment under the laws under which he's been charged. So, the reason why he is where he is because he has to be somewhere. If there were a place other than Russia where he could live safely, communicate, assist the journalists with their work, he would be in that place. He is where he is because when he was transiting through Russia, the United States canceled his passport, and he's not able to travel safely to any other country right now without fear of being brought back here to face the punishment that many, including some on the show, think that he deserves, but he doesn't think so, and I don't think so.
I presume you're referring to Professor Nichols there, and if you are, let me just ask him. I've heard some pretty wild suggestions for punishment, Professor Nichols, everything from they should line him up and shoot him because he's a traitor to the United States, which I presume you don't agree with, to they should make a deal with him somehow just to get him back here and try to resolve this. Where are you on that continuum?
Once again, Mr. Wiseman has piled several issues on each other in a very artful way. I think it is utterly risible to argue that, well, he really had nowhere to go but Russia. That's really a remarkable statement to say, when you're a whistleblower exposing the secrets of the United States government, really the only place you can go and really feel safe from the surveillance state culture is to go to the Russian Federation. That is simply laughable on its face. Now, with that said, I'm sure Edward Snowden wants to come home. I think Edward Snowden is probably still surprised that he didn't get a parade and a trophy. I think he's probably genuinely surprised because, again, like Bradley Manning, I'm sure he was worked by people who convinced him that he was doing something heroic and romantic and noble and exciting and
okay, but what should we do at this point about it?
Dangerous. And I think at this point, if he comes back to the United States, he has to go to trial. This notion of lining people up and shot and all that stuff. First of all, I don't believe in any of that, and I don't think that that's even a consideration, but I'm not going to prejudge what a federal court would do. However, this notion that he should be given clemency is effectively saying to any future defector, and let's call Edward Snowden what he is, a defector, it's saying to any future defector, make sure that you stash enough secrets so that you have something to bargain with in order to come back and escape prosecution. The government, any government, has a vested interest in making it hard to disclose government secrets, and especially in this irresponsible way that Edward Snowden did. Mr. Wizner says, well, they weren't scattered to the wind. Those secrets have traveled all over a good part of the world. And again, Snowden himself cannot possibly know how much he stole or what's in them, just as Bradley Manning later admitted that he had no idea what was in most of those documents. You cannot steal 1.7 million documents and say that you've carefully vetted them all.
Okay,
that's just ridiculous on its face, and he needs to come home and face his responsibilities.
Okay, appreciate your position. Let me get Mr. Wizner's point on that, which is people who make the comparison in history to other whistleblowers like to take the case of Daniel Ellsberg, who of course leaked the Pentagon Papers, whatever it was, 40 or so years ago, and the result was he did stand trial, and he didn't go off to another country. He did, as they say, stay in the States to face the music. Why is that not an option in this case if Edward Snowden is a genuine whistleblower?
Well, look, I think I already answered that question before when I talked about the legal regime that he would face. At the time that Daniel Ellsberg was prosecuted, it had not been established under U.S. law that the Espionage Act even applied to what he did, which is to provide information to the press and not to a foreign enemy. I think he believed, and he probably did at that time, have a strong constitutional defense. And his case never went to trial because of the Nixon administration's misconduct. All the charges were dismissed. But I should also tell you, in that era, Daniel Ellsberg turned himself in and was released on bail the same day. I think the day that Edward Snowden turned himself in would be the last day the public would see him for 60 years. But I also say that, this week we learned about another example. In 1971, a number of activists broke in to an FBI office outside of Philadelphia and stole all the files. They then mailed them to reporters at the Washington Post, not unlike what Edward Snowden did. And just this week, they came forward and revealed their identities. Now, those documents that they stole from the FBI revealed a program of what we now consider to be inappropriate and largely illegal domestic surveillance that the FBI was engaged in. I don't think that they faced a lot of questions about why they didn't stand trial at the time. I think they're being seen the way that history often views whistleblowers. I think what happens is that claims of national security and harm from exposure of secrets rarely age well. On the contrary, I think whistleblowers generally do get treated kindly by history, and I predict that with the passage of time, Edward Snowden will seem much more like Daniel Ellsberg than he seems different from Daniel Ellsberg.
Well, we may not have to wait that long. Professor Nichols, let me read something that was in the New York Times the other day. Their editorial board put this forward. It was on the editorials page. Here's a snippet of it. Considering the enormous value of the information he has revealed and the abuses he has exposed, Mr. Snowden deserves better than a life of permanent exile, fear, and flight. He may have committed a crime to do so, but he has done his country a great service. It is time for the United States to offer Mr. Snowden a plea bargain or some form of clemency that would allow him to return home, face at least substantially reduced punishment in light of his role as a whistleblower, and have the hope of a life advocating for greater privacy and far stronger oversight of the runaway intelligence community. What do you think of that?
I think that really gives up the game, both in the Times' language and in Mr. Wizner's invocation of the break-in that revealed COINTEL profiles. The civil rights community, at least some members of the civil rights community and many in the media, want this to be 1971 again. They want to believe that they can go back to a very heroic, noble era of fighting the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover. And truthfully, that's just romantic nonsense. I think Ellsberg isn't even Ellsberg anymore. That time has not nearly been as kind to Daniel Ellsberg as Mr. Wizner thinks it has been. I think that the one thing that everybody respects about Daniel Ellsberg is that he released a very specific report that he wrote as part of his revelations and stayed and faced the music. Mr. Snowden arrogated to himself a priori the idea that the government was doing things wrong and that he was going to find them out. He got a job under false pretenses to steal material he hadn't even seen, and much of which he has never seen, even as he's released it. because he got it into his head that he doesn't like the way the government is operating. And I think the FBI director's comments this morning, since we brought up the New York Times, I'll bring the FBI director's comments into it. Edward Snowden just doesn't like the way the government's being run. Well, that's his right as a U.S. citizen to not like the way the government's being run. But to who arrogated to Edward Snowden the right to decide what I do or don't need to know as a citizen to make educated decisions? The level of arrogance and narcissism involved in this case is staggering.
Well, but he is making, if you like, a cri de coeur against what he sees is a surveillance state that has its nose in too many people's private business, and that people have lost a good chunk of their privacy in this day and age. Are you not concerned about that?
His cri de coeur about surveillance in the 21st century came before he ever saw a classified document. It's very clear that he'd already made up his mind about this before he applied for a job at Booz Allen. He specifically went for a job at the NSA already believing that he would find exactly what he was looking for. And I don't believe that, and I think it's going to be up to the courts to decide the degree to which these programs are unconstitutional or illegal, and I think we're not there yet. We haven't, our court system hasn't reached that decision. Apparently, the New York Times, Edward Snowden, and the ACLU have already adjudicated this issue.
Mr. Wizner, you want to come back on that?
Oh, it's not just the New York Times. Yeah, well, I think that's almost precisely the point, that we need courts to adjudicate the legality of these programs. What Mr. Snowden saw, and by the way, he was in the intelligence community for nearly a decade, not just for his few months at Booz Allen, so he had a lot of time to learn what he needed to learn about this system. What he saw was that every time groups like the ACLU in the last decade had tried to go to real federal courts to challenge the constitutionality of the NSA's programs, the NSA had told those courts, this case has to be dismissed. These programs are too secret. These plaintiffs don't have standing. They can't show that they've been subjected to these programs. And as a result of that, the court can't even rule on the legality. Instead, we had a secret court system that only hears the government's position. Well, what's happened in the last 6 months? The first document that was released was an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to Verizon, telling it to turn over every day all telephone metadata for all Americans that were its customers, including the ACLU. And as a result of that, we've been able to bring lawsuits in ordinary federal courts, and we had a conservative Republican federal judge in Washington, D.C., describe the NSA's programs as almost Orwellian and almost certainly unconstitutional. Now, that could not have happened but for the publication of this document by The Guardian and by the Washington Post, and they would not have had it had Snowden not given it to them. I do want to respond to one other point, which is, I think, in general, a valid point, which is that one of the functions of criminal law is deterrence. And we do need to worry about precedents that we set based on the way that we apply or don't apply the law. I would only ask that that principle be applied even-handedly. You know, Washington is full of high government officials who have lied to Congress, who have ordered the torture of prisoners, who have been engaged in all kinds of programs that either at the time or later were considered to be illegal, and either were never charged or were pardoned because they were high officials. And I think that we have this sort of, oh dear response. What if we don't punish this 29-year-old? Well, we don't punish his bosses. And I think the difference between Mr. Snowden and people in the intelligence community who set up secret prisons where people were tortured is that they profoundly harm the country, and that the effects of the debate that he launched are going to be profoundly helpful to the country.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's our time, but I want to thank both of you for coming on the program tonight and helping us out with this. It was a very good, civilized debate on a very, very tricky subject. So thank you very much to Ben Wizner from the ACLU, Tom Nichols from the U.S. Naval War College. Good of both of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.